In the previous session, we discussed what happens at a cell level when we get injured, along with the consistent timescales involved in the process of healing. Now, it's with this knowledge that we can start to make some sensible choices to help the process move on efficiently. You'll remember that during the bleeding and the inflammatory phase, I referred to the injured tissues producing what I called an inflammatory gravy. The production of this gravy within the injured tissue can make movement stiff and painful as the pain nerve receptors become stimulated by pressure and the changing chemical environment. And it's here that we can attempt to limit the volume of the inflammatory fluid with the use of ice, compression and elevation over the first 72 hours to 7 days. Now, we all know that if you don't stir gravy, it begins to thicken and go a bit gloopy. So a really important addition to the management of this stage is the need to stir the gravy and keep the injured area gently moving to ensure that the healing tissue remains fluid and effective. You may remember that we discussed the second repair phase of healing, which begins at around 4 days, peaks at around 3 and finishes at 5 weeks. This is characterised by the laying down of repair tissue fibres, which is quite haphazard and disorganised at first, and if we fail to apply gentle stresses to the new repaired tissue, it will remain disorganised and stiffen further. During this stage, therefore, it's quite important that we move the injured body part as pain and discomfort allow. Remember, pain doesn't mean harm, so it is perfectly safe to move this area of the body under its own steam. This will allow the new repair tissue to become organised in line with the requirements of the tissue it's replacing and can rapidly improve its situation through the application of more and more movement gradually through the middle and the later remodelling stages of the healing process. So given that we now understand what happens on a cell level, we need to give some attention to how the brain processes the information it receives from the body via its communicating nerve network. We need to consider this on 2 levels, but let's take a look at the automatic response that happens in the subconscious brain, as this is probably the least complex of the 2 ways that the brain makes sense of the information it receives. The brain firstly has to formulate a protective strategy to look after the healing stages that we've described. The brain response is fairly straightforward. It can either turn a muscle activity up to protect it, or use the alternative strategy, which is turning a muscle activity down to prevent normal movement as a means of protection. But the truth is that it's probably a combination of both of these strategies. A simple example of a switch-on strategy would be a muscle spasm in response to a bending movement of the back, for example. And an example of a switch-off strategy might be the protective limp to prevent a lower limb injury being exposed to further stress. What is really important to realise at this stage is that the way that the brain reacts to an injury can cause some longer term concerns, such as weakness in the muscles that have been switched off. So part of the management of injury involves employing measures to prevent weakening of the muscles in the healing phase as pain allows. But again, we'll come back to that in a later section. Now here I think it's appropriate to quickly revisit the pain doesn't mean harm point that I made in an earlier session. You might see that it's now possible that the brain's outgoing response could actually be the cause of pain in some situations. For example, the protective muscle spasm could be the source of a lower back pain rather than a structural injury itself, or the reduced stability caused by lowered muscle activity could expose a joint to unwanted stress. We'll cover these strategies and how we guard against them becoming long-term problems, as well as look at the second and slightly more complex level of the brain's processing in the next session. Now, if I can once again just take a moment to reiterate that these sessions cover general principles and they're not intended as a substitute for an individual consultation from a suitably qualified professional, which you should always seek if you do have any particular concerns. Do give me a like or a share if you like what you hear, or drop me a message or email if you have any specific questions. I think that's about it for this session, and we'll hopefully see you again next time.